My name's Robin Lloyd, co-chair of the Disarm Committee of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, U.S. section. I'm co-host of this webinar with Ellen Thomas and Cherrill Spencer. Yeah, so we're going to be talking today really about feminist peace and how issues of importance to women from around the world have been disseminated and internationalized through the United Nations and sometimes put into law. So what is feminist peace and what is the alternative to it? Well, the alternative really is what we have right now, a kind of uneasy peace, even though the UN Secretary General has called for a global ceasefire that has not been moved forward as much as it should have been. With anxieties, depressions, higher levels of suicide now with COVID-19, and with the men still controlling most of the strings, at least where it matters, in the military and corporations. So when the UN was created 75 years ago, it was sustained by the hopes of the people of the world, but controlled largely by the masters of power politics. So see our 1945 timeline, which is accessible, to, that just took over my whole screen here. So I have to get back to it, which is accessible on the WILPF US Disarm page. And for example, one of the examples we give is that Nelson Rockefeller, who was FDR's Assistant Secretary of State at that time, he really sweet-talked the countries of Latin America so that they would vote for a UN structure that empowered the powerful by giving the then 5 winners of World War II the veto in the Security Council. Fellow Disarm co-chair Cherrill Spencer will say a few words about those foundational events 75 years ago that we have portrayed in our timeline, 1945. Go ahead, Cherrill.
Good afternoon, everyone. WILPF, which was founded in 1915 in the midst of World War I, was disappointed at the end of that war with the League of Nations, which came out of the infamous Versailles Treaty. WILPF viewed it as a league of conquerors against the conquered. As World War II came to an end, the Allies realized a new world organization was needed to maintain the ensuing peace. Government delegates developed a draft charter for a new United Nations in October 1944, but WILPF was not happy with its lack of emphasis on justice and equitable socio-economic conditions. So WILPF was keen to take part, as much as they could, in the founding conference of the UN in the spring of 1945 in San Francisco. Members of my branch, Palo Alto, the US section and international WILPF all attended as observers and submitted to the US delegation and the president of the conference firmly worded suggestions for changes in the draft charter. You can read more details about WILPF and the UN founding conference on this website, and I will put the link to that in the chat later. While the final United Nations Charter did not embody everything that WILPF desired, it did include a human rights section and an economic and social council with potential for providing services, which the draft charter did not. There was a grand signing of the charter ceremony on the 26th of June, and then the delegates from 50 countries went home to get their governments to ratify the UN Charter, just as countries are now ratifying the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which has obtained, we're happy to say, 47 of the required 50 signatures for that treaty to go into force. President Truman urged the US Senate to ratify the UN Charter as soon as possible, which they did on the 28th of July, 1945. Truman returned from the Potsdam Conference in Germany on the 7th of August, and he signed and ratified the UN Charter on the 8th of August. You will notice the irony that this important act of agreeing to a new international peacekeeping organization took place between the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the US. They happened on the 6th and the 9th of August. This is a photograph of Truman signing the UN Charter on the 8th of August. The United Nations finally came in and officially came into existence on October the 24th, 1945, after the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, China, and France, as well as a majority of the other signatories, had all ratified the UN Charter. The very first resolution the UN General Assembly passed when they first met in early 1946, this first resolution established a commission to deal with the problems raised by the discovery of atomic energy. One of the specific proposals that commission was to make was, and I'm quoting, for the elimination from national armaments of atomic weapons and of all other major weapons adaptable to mass destruction. This resolution was passed unanimously, including the US, but the US did not abide by it and continued to develop and build nuclear weapons, as we will hear about shortly from our speaker, Ray Acheson. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Cheryl. So for me, it's always been a question, how does one really lobby at the United Nations? You know, it seems difficult to understand. Presidents appoint UN ambassadors, and those ambassadors are really not vulnerable to grassroots pressure. So I'm hoping today our guests will demystify that through explaining the two areas of WILPF that we are most active in, PeaceWomen and disarmament. So just to go back again, in 1948, WILPF became one of the first non-governmental organizations and the first women's peace organization to be granted consultative status with the UN Economic and Social Council, a status that gives us access to all of the UN bodies that are open to NGOs, including the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. Other women's groups were also granted consultative status, and over time, we have bonded together in a group called Congo, Conference of NGOs, which was formed in preparation for the UN Decade of Women, which started in 1975. So 4 world conferences on women were sponsored by the UN and have taken place. The last and most momentous one was the UN 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing, China in 1995, which I went to, and I hope several on this call may have also gone to way back then. The Beijing Platform for Action is still an inspiration for making positive change for women and men and girls and boys. Nevertheless, we're still waiting for the 5th World Conference on Women. I could go on, but just to mention that Congo organizes a conference for NGOs every year in New York City during the time that the official New York Commission on the Status of Women is meeting to work on the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women. It's an exhilarating experience to take part in the workshops, the panels, and speak outs with women from around the world, bringing their hopes, needs, suffering, and aspirations for building a feminist peace. So here is our first speaker, Ray Acheson. As Ray is speaking, please put your questions in the chat window, and we will go to them after both the speakers are finished. So as director of the Reaching Critical Will project of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Ray has spent a decade doing disarmament work in the UN system. She is also a member of the steering group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN. So please take it away, Ray.
Great. Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you to Ellen and Cheryl and to everybody else for being here today. It's great to connect with members whenever we have the chance, and especially in these very unprecedented times. Since we can't meet at the UN right now, it's great to still talk about what the UN is and is not doing, and its member states in particular. So I'm going to give a little bit of a rundown of what the Reaching Critical Will program is and does. And then I'm going to go into a little bit about Robin's question around how do you do lobbying at the UN, and also an update on what's happening right now with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which Cheryl has already mentioned that we're only 3 ratifications away from reaching the requisite 50, but there's a lot more that's happening right now, so I'll update on that as well. But first, just on the program, WILPF started the Reaching Critical Will program in 1999, and it was set up around the same time as PeaceWomen, which Genevieve will cover after, which was set up in 2000. And so it was really, both programs initially were geared towards making the UN more accessible to activists around the world. As Robin and Cheryl have clearly laid out, WILPF has always been engaged with the UN, but it's a difficult place to do work. And so focusing on the themes of women, peace, and security, and on disarmament with these specific programs, WILPF was really able to become a leader, a civil society coordinator for inputs from other NGOs and activists into what was happening at the UN, and then also to take information about what member states were doing and pull that out of the UN and try and make it more accessible and understandable to a general public, because the UN is a queen of jargon, and it's certainly a tricky place to maneuver if you're not sure what's going on or where you can be useful or what's really relevant for the real world. So Reaching Critical Will does a number of things in order to make the UN more accessible. First of all, we have a website which provides primary documentation from pretty much every forum that the UN holds related to disarmament and weapons and militarism. And I'm going to go into more what issues we cover shortly. So this is about making things transparent and accessible. Up until recently, the UN website didn't have very much information. They didn't even provide statements from conferences that were read out by governments. And you had to know where to look for transcripts of events that would come out days or weeks after the event was over. So we really took pride in trying to make information accessible in real time, which has obviously become easier as time has gone on and technology has developed. We also do analysis of this. So we're not just putting out the information, but we're giving a WILPF perspective on what's happening. So this means a feminist, anti-war, anti-militarist perspective on what governments are saying and doing at the UN. And we share that analysis with the governments themselves in the room, with diplomats, through reporting that we do and distribute at the UN. And we also make it publicly available again on our website and through email listservs so that it can reach activists and academics and researchers around the world. Then we do advocacy as well, directly with the governments to try and change positions and advance issues from our perspective as well. And for that, we work a lot in coalition with other activist groups. So Robin mentioned the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. That's one of the coalitions that Reaching Critical Will is part of. We're also part of the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots and the International Network on Explosive Weapons and the International Action Network on Small Arms, just to name a few. And in addition to this sort of coalition advocacy work that we do, we're also the civil society coordinators for many of these conferences. So RCW will help set up segments where NGOs can talk directly to meetings of the General Assembly First Committee or to the Non-Proliferation Treaty or to many other forums, so that diplomats can hear directly from us in the room, not just through our writing and through our advocacy, but also formally on the record in these conferences. And we try, where possible, to bring as many activist groups and NGOs together to form common positions where it's possible, but at least to give space to different groups to voice their opinions. And then lastly, we also do public education. So Reaching Critical Will tries as much as possible to speak to students and other activists and also to the media in order to let people know what's happening at the UN, but also on our issue areas more broadly. So not all of what we do is focused just on the inner workings of the UN, but we're also doing a lot of research around what's happening, for example, with nuclear weapon modernization or with drone strike programs or with the international arms trade. And so we try and tie in these sort of global real world incidents or facts and relate it to what's happening at the UN in a way that's understandable to the general public. What issues we work on. So when RCW was formed back in 1999, the main focus was on nuclear weapons. And the program was started around one of the preparatory committees for the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that was kind of the origin story, was trying to get out information about what was happening with the NPT ahead of the 2000 review conference. But since then, we've expanded our work greatly so that we also cover the UN's work on small arms and light weapons and the international arms trade, on explosive weapons, and particularly on their use in populated areas. That's one of the topics we cover, which sounds really technical, but basically it's referring to the bombing that we see that happens every day in towns and cities at different conflict zones, and trying to prevent that from happening. We're also active on drones, which have not really been taken up in a concerted way in the UN beyond some discussions about transparency and non-proliferation, but there hasn't been enough activity at the UN yet on drone strikes. But one area that's related to that we have advanced somewhat has been on autonomous weapon systems, which are really terrifying technologies that are seeking to take human beings out of the loop of the use of force and the use of weapons, so that algorithms will be programmed into machines and basically will be able to target or strike targets without a human being in the loop. So we're working on trying to preventively ban those weapons with the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. RCW is also active on cybersecurity and cyber peace issues. And as WILPF, we've tried to reframe the debate as being about cyber peace and to push back on the militarism that we're seeing already happening in the cyber realm, and to bring feminist perspectives into the preservation of cyberspace and online safety and security in the militarist framework, which is where it's sort of included right now in the UN. And we do a little bit of work on biological and chemical weapons, but chemical weapons is really dealt with in The Hague, not at the UN in Geneva or New York, which is where we have a presence. So we cover chemical weapons and biological weapons at the First Committee and the bioweapons conferences that happen in Geneva, but we're less engaged in those issues just because of capacity and location and things like that. But we do try and stay on top of those weapons and work on it when we can. So that's kind of the really brief history, and I can definitely expand on any of that in questions later on. But I wanted to turn now to Robin's question about how we do advocacy at the United Nations. And surprisingly, actually, diplomats are a really good point of advocacy. It may seem that they're not, I think Robin said, they're not susceptible to pressure, but I think it's important to recognize that policy isn't always top down. So the policy that's being set for a country's positions, I think there's this perception that we have that's set at the top levels of government. And that's not always the case. Interestingly, what I've learned from working in the United Nations for the past 15 years is that the diplomats that we work with can actually take ideas back to their capitals and work within their ministries of foreign affairs and other relevant departments to change policies and positions of their governments, or to adapt to changing circumstances, and to really advance things and be progressive actors within these institutions back home. And I think the key to really doing that kind of work is to building up relationships and becoming a trusted source of information and analysis for governments. The provision of analysis and our expertise through our writing at the UN or through our work within coalitions with other NGOs really helps to build up a sense that we know what we're talking about, and we have a broad group of stakeholders behind our advocacy. We work a lot in our coalitions with survivors of weapons. Good examples of that have been the campaigns that banned landmines and cluster bombs. Also, ICANN has included survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as nuclear weapon testing. So making sure that those voices and those perspectives are fully integrated in the coalitions and campaigns that we're working on. And, that kind of trust has to be built over years, that we are credible entities that governments can rely on for information and, up-to-date analysis of situations. That's something that a lot of time and effort into. And the coalitions, again, really help with this too, because not just the numbers of groups or of people that are involved in a particular campaign advancing a particular position or a demand or an ask from governments, but also having as many representatives from different countries as possible is also really useful, because then national level political officials will be getting the same messages and the same outreach and the same sort of, they'll be talked to about the same issues in a similar way as we're doing at the United Nations that their diplomats are hearing. So that kind of cross-national and transnational work is extremely important as well for doing advocacy at the UN. Another thing that NGOs do in the disarmament space, and I'm sure in other spaces as well, is try to actually be a source that convenes governments together, either in regional groups or in small cross-regional groups. So we sometimes will host meetings, informal meetings, where we'll invite certain diplomats from what we think will be a good cross-regional mix of countries to work together on an issue. So we did this in regards to the nuclear ban treaty. We did that in regards to developing the arms trade treaty as well. And so that it's not just that we're outside as some sort of oppositional or critical force, which we definitely are a lot of the time, but that also we can build these partnerships so that we're not just always critiquing what the governments are doing, but we're also trying to bring them together to advance progressive policy when that is possible and when that is necessary. And that has a lot to do with building community, like in any of our activism. I'm sure many of you have experiences with this and might be surprised to see how similar it is played out at the UN in terms of building relationships, communities, and networks of trust and information. So we did all of this with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, working with the non-nuclear armed states who have fully rejected nuclear weapons. So this means that we didn't have this kind of community building with the nuclear arms, or even to a large extent with the nuclear umbrella states, the ones that say they rely on US nuclear weapons for security, like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization countries. But with all the countries that have actually and completely rejected nuclear weapons, we've worked quite closely with in order to do the initial thinking around what a treaty could look like, and how to carry this out through a UN process. And all of this work that I've described that we do, it really enabled us to shore up support for the treaty, even in the face of massive pressure from the nuclear armed states. And there has absolutely been a lot of pressure from them. There was pressure on them not to support the start of negotiations at the General Assembly. That was in 2016 when the General Assembly was voting on whether to negotiate a treaty, nuclear ban treaty. So there was a lot of pressure leading up to that. There was pressure on them then not to join negotiations once those started in 2017. Then there was pressure to not sign and ratify the treaty once the treaty was adopted. And this week it was just revealed, I saw someone in the chat box posted a link to the article from the Associated Press, but the US government has actually been demanding that states that have ratified the TPNW withdraw, which is very unprecedented for a government to tell other countries that they've made a strategic error, is how the US put it, and need to withdraw. So this is quite belligerent. These countries haven't made a mistake. They don't just not know what they've signed up to. It's extremely offensive and demeaning to these countries to say that the entire legislative process that they've gone through to ratify the treaty, because in most countries you have to have parliamentary debates, it has to get signed by different levels of the executive, of the government. It's a real process that has taken some of these countries, the last 3 years to complete. And so for the US to just say, oh, you made a mistake and you need to withdraw from this treaty, it's absolutely incredible. But it's pretty consistent with what we've seen throughout this process from the nuclear armed states. During the negotiations of this treaty, we saw a lot of really patriarchal and also colonial pressure on governments. So France was really active in trying to get, former French colonies to not support the treaty. The UK was active in a similar way. The US was active in a similar way. So just really kind of racist, colonial, patriarchal approach from the nuclear armed states towards the countries that supported the nuclear ban, and really trying to ridicule them and tell them at several points that these countries were being emotional for supporting nuclear abolition and for wanting to talk about the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. So as feminists, we can all recognize the patriarchal implications of that. All of that being said, all of that pressure aside, in the face of all that, we are still just 3 ratifications away. So that means that any day now we're going to see the 50th ratification, which will lead to the entry into force of the treaty. So when we get 50, the treaty doesn't enter into force immediately. There's a 90-day gap just to make sure that everyone that's ratified can get its national legislation in line. So in 90 days after the 50th ratification, the treaty will enter into force and become international law. But before that happens, we've already seen how the treaty is having an impact. And it's having an impact even on countries that haven't signed and ratified it. One of the biggest things that we can see here is through divestment from nuclear weapon producers. And so we've seen that many big pension funds and banks and other financial institutions, including in the United States and in NATO countries and in Australia, they've divested their money from nuclear weapon producers, and they've said it's because nuclear weapons will soon be illegal under international law. And so these are financial institutions that have also divested from cluster bombs and from landmines, and that are trying to divest from fossil fuels. We're doing that same work now with nuclear weapons, and it's already having a big impact. We've also seen in national parliamentary debates in many of the countries that supposedly support nuclear weapons, where the government support them, many parliamentarians and mayors and other city officials speaking out against nuclear weapons and calling on their federal governments to join the treaty. And so there's an I Can Cities appeal that you can get your mayor or your city council to sign up to. So here in New York City, we've been working with the New York City Council to have legislation adopted that will both call on the US government to join the TPNW, but also withdraw all New York City pension funds from nuclear weapon producing companies. And that's been going on, that kind of work's been going on in many cities around the US and across Europe and other places where the federal government doesn't yet support the treaty. So there's lots of work going on. We're very hopeful about entry into force happening soon. And we're also just excited about how this has been such an excellent example of activists working with governments to make progressive policy change. Of course, there's much work to do still to achieve the total elimination of nuclear weapons, and that work will be ongoing, but we see this as a shift in the stigmatization and the normative refusal and rejection of nuclear weapons that will have a lasting impact and a meaningful impact on policies going forward. Thanks.
Wow, well, thank you so much, Ray. And that's quite exciting to hear the upbeat account of the treaty. And I see that there's lots of questions, but what we'd like to do is invite our second speaker to speak right now, and then questions will come after. So our second speaker is Genevieve Riccoboni. She is the Program Associate for WILPF's Women, Peace and Security Program, where she coordinates all the communications and the delegations for the program. She holds a number of degrees, including a master's in world history from the University of Cambridge. Women, Peace and Security is a part of PeaceWomen, which was founded in the year 2000 to strengthen women's rights and participation in international peace and security efforts. So thank you, Genevieve. Go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Robin. Thank you, Cheryl and Ellen and everyone for coming. I'm so happy to be here today with all of you. As Robin just mentioned, I'm the program associate at the Women, Peace and Security Program. And yeah, I primarily support on the delegations, the communications, but also on the research and the writing and the monitoring that the program does, which I can get into. And as Robin and Ray mentioned, the PeaceWomen program was started in the year 2000. That's the same year that UN Security Council Resolution 1325 was passed after many years of women advocating and speaking about the impacts of war on women and girls, as well as marginalized groups. That resulted in the passing of this resolution in the Security Council. And it focuses on a few things. It focuses on women's participation, so on women having a say in decision-making in all aspects of peace and security, on prevention of violence and prevention of conflict, which is really critical, although that's not always focused on by a lot of the actors who are doing the implementation. And I can get into that later. Also on protection in terms of responding to violence and providing services for survivors of violence, as well as relief and recovery after conflict. And so this resolution recognized that war has gendered impacts, and since then there have been 9 subsequent resolutions. And this year is the 20th anniversary of this passing, and so I think it's a big year of like stock taking and of kind of assessing what the progress, or rather lack thereof, has been in terms of these issues. And so the PeaceWomen program is also based at the WILPF office in New York, and we focus on advocating for the holistic implementation of this agenda from an anti-militarist, from an intersectional perspective. And the holistic aspect is really important because, you know, as feminist, anti-militarist activists, we have been using these resolutions to advocate for conflict prevention, for the prevention of violence, for an end to imperialism. But we've seen a lot of cherry picking, a lot of uneven implementation, and the program really focuses on elevating women's voices, particularly in countries that are experiencing armed conflict and fragility, or are like newly post-conflict, such as Afghanistan, Colombia, Libya, Yemen, Syria. These are just a few examples, the DRC, Cameroon. And so a lot of our work focuses on that, although it's also global in scope, and the agenda is certainly one that is also being implemented globally. And so the program has a few different main areas of work and components. One aspect of our work is monitoring, and we do monitoring on a couple of different levels. So we monitor the UN system and government's implementation of WPS. Some of that is also through transparency initiatives. So as Ray was talking about the Reaching Critical Will website, and about how a lot of resources were not available on the UN website in the past. Similarly, WILPF created the PeaceWomen website to share resources on discussions about women's participation, about prevention, about all these issues that I was previously discussing. And so our website has over 30,000 resources on women, peace, and security. And we monitor the UN system mainly focusing on WPS. So a lot of this has been focusing on the Security Council, because this is the body that is kind of seen as the main implementing actor, or one of the main implementing actors of this sort of set of policies. But we also monitor other spaces. And in the past, the program has also done a wider range of monitoring, although we have now targeted this monitoring a little bit more in recent years. We also monitor sustainable development spaces because what we've noticed is that not only are those discussions really critical to discussions about conflict prevention, you know, like creating a world that actually meets people's human needs, that actually fulfills human rights, that provides food, that ends poverty, housing. So we see that as being very much linked, and those sustainable development conversations as critical to realizing gender equality and the human rights of women and girls, as well as all people. And so we also monitor other discussions on gender equality, such as CSW, and bring delegations of women to the UN for a lot of these big conferences. And I was helping to coordinate the delegation for CSW 64, which I think many of you were going to come to, and it was really disappointing to not be able to be there with all of you there. So that was a huge disappointment. We were going to have a delegation of, I think, over 60 WILPF members from the US, as well as many other countries, and that was going to be really exciting. But unfortunately, the global pandemic put a wrench into our plans. So I guess going back a little bit, we also write articles, we monitor some of these discussions. Some of these are thematic discussions about like protection of civilians, about women, peace, and security, about sexual violence, but also country discussions. And there's a lot of country discussions in the UN Security Council, especially, that really exclude a gender perspective. And there's others in which there's a kind of superficial discussion of women's rights or of women's participation, but it is at a very superficial level. And so we work with women activists from WILPF's global network to really elevate their voices. And one way that we do that is, I'll discuss in a little bit, but my colleague Zareen Hamid works a lot with women who are briefers to the Security Council, who will brief the Security Council on their country's situations, and they'll speak about it from their perspectives and really bring that critical analysis into that very securitized space. The other aspect of the monitoring, which we do as a program and which is also on our website, is we monitor the development and implementation of national action plans. A lot of countries, over 80 at this point, 87, sorry, have developed national action plans for implementing these policies. I could go into this for quite a while, but I'll pause for now. But basically what we do is we track when states develop these plans and then report on them, as well as other commitments that these countries are making. And we're actually creating a new micro site to further deepen this work and to sort of integrate it a little bit more to link up work at the country level on these topics. And I'll just note that many WILPF members have been involved in the development and advocating for these plans in their own countries, and that work is really, really important. Another aspect of the work is advocacy. And one way that we also do that, as RCW does that, is through coalitions. So WILPF helped to found and is an active member of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security. And that is a coalition of organizations that work on women, peace, and security at the UN. And one of the things that the NGO Working Group does, among many, it brings together member states to discuss these topics. It helps facilitate the civil society briefers that I was mentioning earlier. Last year, just as one example, I can just pop this in the chat, but Jamila Afghani, who's the president of WILPF Afghanistan, she briefed the Security Council last year, and we helped to facilitate her statement. So that was a really exciting opportunity, and many other WILPF members and partners have also briefed the Security Council, or several have. We're also involved in other coalitions. We're currently a global organizing partner of the Women's Major Group, which is the feminist coalition around sustainable development. And I think that work is exciting because it has we've helped to bridge, I think, the gap pretty well between the development spaces, which very often exclude discussions of the impacts of militarism, the impacts of armed conflict, and especially disarmament issues are very, very absent from the discussions on development. And so WILPF has really helped to bring in that feminist anti-militarist analysis to these spaces that have previously not had them. And I think this is also true of other feminist spaces, often focus on what are really important issues, but often also leave out that anti-militarist analysis. So that's another way in which we have tried to promote a more integrated approach across the UN system for addressing the impacts of war and violence. And yeah, I could go on this for a while, but I think that one thing I want to talk about is during the COVID context, we, along with the rest of WILPF, have, I think, really shifted in responding to this new world and all of the impacts of it, both in terms of the public health crisis as well as the economic impact. And one thing that WILPF did really quickly was really galvanize around the call for a global ceasefire that the Secretary General put forward. WILPF worked together across programs to produce feminist principles for what the ceasefire could look like and for what a gender-sensitive pandemic response could be. Notably, the Security Council was absent during this time. It did not act for months on this call for the ceasefire. Even after 2 months when it did finally agree to a resolution, there was still a carve out for counterterrorism. That was a huge disappointment, and I think shows the failure in that regard to really respond when there was an urgent need to act and to act for peace. And COVID has notably shifted a lot of the work, especially in terms of delegations. Like, we had a lot of that planned for this year, especially because this year, with the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325, we were planning a very big delegation, as well as we have been conducting over the course of the year research assessing the state of implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda from the perspective of the people who are advocating for it in the beginning, which is feminist peace activists. So we have a report coming out, which is very exciting, and some of my colleagues have been working on that. Some of you might have attended our webinar yesterday, and I can pop the links to that in the chat. We have recordings in both English and Spanish, and I think that I'll just end with one thing that I think is sort of a persistent challenge as we're thinking about the last 20 years, which is that, and this came out really in the report and in the research from what WILPF members were saying, is ultimately, the work to advance women's participation and rights, to advocate for conflict prevention, that has been really, I think, to some extent co-opted by governments to. They've interpreted participation as being about adding women to militaries and security structures, as opposed to what women activists have wanted, which is for women to be in decision-making around, at the peace tables, to be the ones deciding how to rebuild a country after conflict, how to successfully resolve a conflict. And to also recognize the critical work that women are doing on the ground in terms of humanitarian response, in terms of actually building peace in their communities, in terms of bringing people together, bridging divides. That's the work that has not been recognized by the Council. And in fact, we've seen a lot of intimidation, a lot of shrinking space for civil society, increased repression. This is something that I'm sure Ray can also speak to. And so that has been, we've seen such a pushback in that regard, and increased repression of civil society rather than that increased space to actually participate and to have a say in the future and to really have that leadership for peace. And I think, yeah, that cherry picking is a challenge, and that speaks to the persistence of militarism and to how ingrained militarism is within these structures. Even that we're working in, and trying to advance advance peace and equality. So yeah, I guess I'll just end there. And yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, well, thank you. Cheryl is going to bring up some of the questions that were asked, but I would just like to ask one to get started. And that is, I mean, both of the organizations are doing so much incredible work. I'm just wondering, how many staff people do you have for Reaching Critical Will and PeaceWomen? And then the ultimate question, maybe this could be dealt with at the end of the talk, is how do we volunteer? How do we try to take part? But if you could just answer the staff questions, I think that would be interesting to know as we go into all of the other questions over here.
Sure, yeah. So Reaching Critical Will currently has 3 staff people, 2 based in New York and 1 in Geneva, and PeaceWomen has 2, both based in New York.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah, we currently have 2 consultants as well.
Yeah. Good. Okay, so Cheryl.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Right. So that's yes. I was thinking the same thing, Robin. How many people does it take to do all these things? It's very impressive that you managed to deal with so many different things.